morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are, and welcome back to Achampnator Reads. This time we continue with The Last Elf, chapter 32. The cave was vast. Hidden among the verses was a description of it. In the dark and stony wood, doves sleep enchanted, calm and good. There it was, on the right, the stalactite where the water and gold had formed, the outline of 4 turtle doves. They had to reach it and from there find the next step. The dream will fall from above. The dream? What dream could that be? An elfish dream and veil are the same thing. The veil of dreams. The slender and transparent stalagmite down at the left and then back to the right where they would find. The mirror of the girl, so proud. The mirror of old age, bent and bowed. The little pool formed by the water that dripped from above in which were reflected the stalactites in the shapes of a young woman and an old woman with a walking stick. George had often wondered about the meaning of the poems his mother had left him, which, if truth be known, had always struck him as rather insipid, but which had now acquired a precise meaning about showing the way. For a moment he had been filled with horror that had turned his stomach into a frozen lump. At the idea of the number of lives for which he had assumed responsibility, and the incalculable pain that his failure would cause. He wasn't just risking the life of Robbie, who was already the light of his own life, but also of these 2 unfortunates and their wives and children. As he made his way across the vast cavern, dug beneath the whole of the city of Dalagar by the waters of the river Dogan over the past millennium, Yosh got his spirits back. The ancient verses describing the way through the stalagmites provided a safe trail to follow. That had belonged to the elves. He was the last of his tribe, and perhaps the most powerful. If not him, then who? The watery mirror reflected the torches, his own and Clover's, 100-fold, so he didn't immediately notice that the light was getting brighter. Finally, a ray of sunlight appeared among the gilded stalactites, lighting up the dust as though it were a swarm of stars. Inside the light stood a golden throne, on which the blue ivy drew swirls that alternated with elfish letters. On the throne sat an ancient king. His skeleton was covered with golden vestments, and on his head a glittering crown of gold with blue ivy leaves. In his hands he still held his sword, its gold hilt likewise enameled with blue shoots of ivy. The blade was sunk into the stone floor. The chain around his neck and the rings he wore on every finger were also of gold and blue ivy. Yosh walked over and the light of day fell upon him, too, giving his hair the gleam of a halo for a moment. He tore at the cobwebs, which fell away in showers of dust, and read, "Here lies he who wore the crown and held the sword." 4 gold columns flanked the stalactites above them, too. The blue ivy writhed around to form a relief so deep that it could be used as a single very long spiral staircase. Yosh looked up, dazzled by the light. He glimpsed an opening edged with ferns. The topmost part of the columns closest to the opening was covered with moss and a few small ferns glistening in the sun. It stopped raining, said Clover. We can go. These columns are proper stairs, added Beach. Robbie had approached the throne as well. Its glow lit up her eyes, which shone like stars. With Robbie nearby, Yosh felt his strength growing and his fear almost fading away. Or perhaps it was the ancient king who, who emanated that strange feeling of power. Yosh looked at the empty eye sockets covered with cobwebs and felt a strange sensation akin to that of belonging. He put his hand on the hilt of the sword, which stonily refused to budge. The sword was stuck so firmly in the rock that it seemed a part of it. George was puzzled for a moment. Then he began to laugh. But of course, it was meant for an elf. It was a trick to ensure that only the right person could remove the sword. A simple question of thermodynamics by reducing the temperature, but also reduce the volume. Once it was cold, the blade would become imperceptibly smaller, but small enough to slip out of the rock as easily as it had entered centuries before. Fortunately, the need to put out the countless fires started by the newborn Erbro had trained him in the extraction of heat. He put his hand on the hilt, closed his eyes, froze the blade, and then pulled it out. The old sword gleamed in his hands. The ivy swirled hilt fit his palm as though made specially for him. Perhaps the trick of extracting heat was exceptional even for an elf. Perhaps the sword had been made not for an elf, but for the most powerful of elves. The last one. All traces of fear disappeared, but a wave of exhaustion passed through him, and he sat down at the feet of the throne, waiting for his forehead to stop burning. It was less painful than putting out Elbrau's fires, but all the same, he needed a little time to recover. When when he got to his feet, he looked at the king. The crown, the neck chain, and the rings had disappeared. Yosh stared in puzzlement at the two soldiers who stole a sidelong glance at him. I have 4 children, and he is 5, they began sheepishly. They are not much used to that corpse. He doesn't have to put bread on anyone's table. He doesn't know what it means to come home without anything to eat and to have everybody crying. If we don't take this stuff, someone else will. Even the judge. The judge might swipe the lot. Josh flashed them a look of fury, but there was nothing he could do. Slowed down by the gates, dispersed by the labyrinth, the judge's soldiers had finally arrived. They hadn't been able to work out which trail they should follow, but they had had the advantage of numbers, since there had been enough of them to take every intersection and to follow every path. They had found their way in the end. The soldiers were beginning to swarm into the lower, deeper part of the cave, but they weren't yet in sight. Using the column as a spiral staircase, Yosh first and Clover at the bottom, the small group began to climb. Beach had taken off his armor, and this time he didn't get stuck. They came out among the ferns by the river. They were in the southern part of the city. The Dogan was swollen with water, and beyond its banks lay the judge's palace. The guards caught sight of them and aimed their bows, but Clover and Beach managed to give the impression that they had already arrested the two fugitives. It really did look as though they were escorting them. They climbed up the bank and set off toward the palace, the boy and girl in the middle, hands behind their backs as though they were in chains, and the two soldiers by the sides. Robbie pretended to stumble and picked up some stones. George was carrying his sword and bow. He tried to keep them hidden between the folds of his long tunic. He had his hands behind his back, and everything was fine until their potential enemies were standing near them. When the first pursuers emerged behind them in the middle of the ferns on the riverbank, the fiction was revealed. A moment before the first arrows began to fly, Clover and Beach started running. They were unusually fast. Even Beach, despite his barrel chest. Yosh didn't see that flight as a betrayal, but actually as a liberation. He no longer had to worry about the two fugitives or their families. Sorry, because they would make it on their own, somehow or other. He only had to deal with the 8 soldiers ahead of him, the 6 on the roof of the palace, the unknown number they had behind them, and the 4 horsemen who were blocking the path. Then he had to get through the big gate and recover his still unnamed horse, hoping that he would find it where he had left it. This time he couldn't use the river as an escape route, because Robbie couldn't swim and she was so small and fragile to resist the cold of the water. But George knew that they would make it. Somehow. He wasn't afraid, not with his sword in his hand. He leaned over to Robbie to tell her not to be scared, and saw that the girl was holding a slingshot and trying to take aim. She nodded firmly, still looking straight ahead. An arrow nearly hit her. Yosh gripped his sword. He was seized by fury at the sight of those soldiers, weighed down with weapons and armor, aiming the bows at 2 poor wretches who hadn't hurt anyone and just wanted to get away. His fury became a storm. A fierce wind rose up against the soldiers. Blinded by the dust, they couldn't take aim, and the few arrows they managed to fire were blown away by furious gusts before they could reach the target. The horses reared up and unseated their riders. Yosh managed to make contact with the might of one of the animals, the big black mare closest to them. He talked to it of freedom and golden beans. In its head, he created images of reins being removed. For a long time, the mare was indecisive, then slowly began to approach. A group of soldiers surrounded the 2 fugitives. There were 3 of them, young, tall, armed with swords. 3 normal, ordinary military swords made of good steel. Yosh's sword flashed brightly when they clashed with his blade. The others splintered and shattered inside his head. Yosh felt the pain of the man whose shoulder he had wounded, the youngest of the 3, but his hatred for anyone who wanted to kill Robbie cancelled it out. More soldiers came running, and yet more. Heap of helmets, shields, and swords in which Yosh could no longer make out faces and expressions. He charged at them, one after another. With each sword that flew into pieces as it made contact with his own, he was filled with courage. An officer with many medals on his armor was about to attack him from behind, but a stone fired by Robbie struck him full in the face. Suddenly the mare made her mind up and began running in that direction, sending the soldiers flying. Yosh managed to stall her and put Robbie in the saddle, almost holding her in his arms, and to do so he had to put down his sword. That was enough time for the tall soldier with a greyish beard who had recently arrested him to come close. A blow from his sword caught Yosh's leg and blood spurted from the gash. Then the man raised his sword to bring it down on Robbie's head. Yosh picked up his sword and fought back, and inside his head he felt the other man dying. He felt the memory of the man's childhood, his fear of the dark and the void, his sorrow for a woman he hadn't married. As sorrow and pain filled his head, Yosh managed to climb onto the mare behind Robbie. He took the bridle, held Robbie tightly, and spurred the mare toward the big gate. They crossed the main square, where the two gallows had already been set up, the big one for him, the smaller one for Robbie. The judge administrator, in his fit of rage, must have abandoned even the merest spark of decency that had made him want to avoid the public execution of a child. The sight of the gallows, designed for Robbie, restored George's desire to fight at all costs, even if it meant wounding or killing. He had to bring her to safety immediately before he was weakened by his injury. He had to win this battle, and quickly. The mare flew through the streets of Dalaga. The gleaming alpha shirt was drawn and covered with blood, and its fierce flash was enough to cast terror into anyone who wanted to stop them. They were at the big gate. The drawbridge was rising in front of them. There were two systems of pulleys, a fast one using ropes and a slower one using chains. Yosh handed Robbie the bridle, took his bow from his shoulder, along with one of the 3 arrows that he kept in a little quiver, attached to his sleeve, and fired. He knew he had to see the target with the eyes of his mind, not his body. As soon as the arrow left his bow, he set fire to its tip. One of the big ropes supporting the bridge was struck right in the middle and partly cut, and began to burn. Then it was the turn of the second bow, partly cut by the arrows, and burned by the flames. The two ropes broke. The bridge fell in front of them with a crash that made the old board splinter and throw up a cloud of reddish dust. The mare galloped over it like the wind. The soldiers around the big gate fled rather than intervening. The dust cloud kept the archers from taking aim. They were free. They had done it. They were free. Josh had a wound in his leg, and Alpha's shirt in his hands, a horse and a bow with a single arrow, and he had Robbie with him. He had done it. They passed through a clearing and a little forest of chestnut trees. The other horse was there. As he had promised. Josh hadn't tethered it, and the horse had stayed where it was. The sun was setting. The air was becoming colder. Josh became aware of a curious sensation at the top of his stomach that he hadn't felt for years. 13, to be precise, and which he identified as hunger. A terrible hunger. He climbed slowly down from the mare and leaned against her body. His wound didn't hurt too much, and his leg still supported him. He tore a strip from his tunic and bound his leg. He collected a few handfuls of chestnuts and shared them with Robbie. Josh wanted to say something. He wanted to say that they had made it. They had been successful. They were alive. They were together. They were free. He would have liked to say how happy he was because she was alive, because she was free, because she was with him. For some reason that he couldn't understand, the thoughts of all the things he could have said tumbled about in his head and collided like argumentative magpies. And in the end of all his thoughts, the only one that came out was the last important, the one that really didn't matter to him at all. We should have left him the crown. The king, I mean. But he was dead. Dead, Robbie objected firmly. He was really very dead. Josh felt more and more embarrassed and stupid. How had he managed, of all the things he wanted to say, to get mixed up? It was written in the book, he explained. He who has the destiny of the warrior will have the sword. He who has the destiny of the ruler, the crown. He recited. He was the king. We should have left him the crown, I think, he added uncertainly. Oh, so that's it, said Robbie. Then it's not all serious. Look. She stuffed her hand into a big, filthy canvas bag, and the elfish crown glittered as she brought it out. Josh stared open-mouthed at the crown. "Did you take it?" "No, Beach took it. The fat one. He climbed up ahead of me when we came out into the air, and it was easy to slip it out of his bag. He still had the rings for his children. There were loads of them. Rings, I mean, I'm a good thief. You know I can steal anything," she added with a little smile. That was both shy and proud. "But if you say it's important, next time we pass by there, we'll give it back to the king. So he'll be happier. Will he come back to life like the rat, or will he stay dead?" "He'll stay dead." Josh wished he could think of something more clever to say, but he consoled himself. There would be time soon. At that moment they didn't have any. A hunt was certainly being organized back there. They would have to get a move on. Their mare was called Patch. Josh had read that from its memory, but his own horse was still unnamed. It must have changed hands lots of times. There had been considerable confusion about its names, and none of them had stayed in its mind. He had to give the horse a name that was completely right for it, as Fido had been for the dog. He thought about something that would give an idea of both its speed and its beauty. "I'll call you Lightning," he said out loud. Robbie thought that all of the names you could give a horse, that was the weirdest. You call a horse Patch or Hoof or Tail or simply Horse. She thought that this one would probably be the first and last horse ever in the world to be called Lightning, because it was really a stupid name. But she said nothing. The horse's mind replied with a nod of agreement. Josh on Lightning and Robbie on Patch. They headed for the House of Orphans, each of them munching on their handful of raw chestnuts, slowly to make them last as long as possible. During the first part of the journey, Josh became aware of his terrible exhaustion. Exhaustion so complete that it turned into pain, but then eased slightly. The sky opened up. A few stars shone. Every now and again, he and Robbie glanced at one another. Josh felt the pain of having killed a man, an injury to his leg, and an army hot on his heels, but at the same time of his whole life so far, a life that had included flight on the dragon. This was his happiest moment. They reached the House of Orphans as dawn was rising. A soft cold mist rose from the ground. They were tired, happy, hungry, and free. As they passed through a vineyard that blazed with red and gold, two brigands appeared in front of them. They were masked and armed, with flash and slums cudgels, and wearing the unmistakable rags of the House of Orphans. They threatened horrible reprisals if the horses weren't given to them immediately. There was a moment of mutual puzzlement. Then they all recognized each other. Their assailants were Falco and Foulpest. They were cheerful and declared that the dragon, before the bear had sent it to sleep, had entrusted them with the task of rounding up as many horses as they could, to take everyone to the sea. Josh and Robbie had been the first two riders to come that way. Who was everyone? Everyone who had joined up with them. Falco and Foulpest explained. When the rain had stopped and the smell of the roasting meat had spread around the area, settling on poor villages and farms where the rabbits were better fed than the humans. All the starving people had joined up with them. The ones who had nothing, the ones who had nobody. They had gathered up all the uprooted and the poverty stricken, the ones who had lost their land and had dreamed of finding new land. And there were plenty of them. Still on horseback, Josh and Robbie reached the clearing where the House of Orphans stood. There were the remains of fires all over the place, some of them still smoking, and as the smoke rose, it mingled with the fog. On the ground, goose, chicken, and duck feathers mixed with autumn leaves. 3 empty beer casks lay on their sides around the dragon, with people sleeping inside them. Others were inside Flash and Slum's cottage, and a few were in the farmyard. The House of Orphans was no longer standing. Is in its place, an unbelievable number of stones were piled up to form a small hill. It had been demolished. With the help of Falco and Foulpest, Robbie got down from Patch's back, stopped to look at the House of Orphans, then bent down, picked up a stone, and hurled it at what was left of the north wall close to where she had slept. She stood there motionlessly for a long time, gazing into the distance. Kala spotted her and ran toward her, shouting. She had kept aside a real chicken thigh for her valiantly defending it against everything and everyone. Chickens don't do that much thinking, and they taste better than rats too. The dragon was in a stinking mood, frankly, and had an unbearable headache. Yosh furiously asked how he could have thought of leading two innocents astray, transforming them into brigands and horse thieves. The dragon replied that the word innocent was clearly a matter of opinion, and that these two already possessed such natural talents for banditry that it would have been an act of cruelty not to allow them to express it. In any case, if George was so clever that he had a better way of gathering the people who had shown up and transporting them all the way to Astrid, he was more than willing to listen to his advice. There were the orphans from the House of Orphans, who ranged from little more than toddlers to teenagers. The other children could walk, but the little more than toddlers couldn't, which meant that they had to be carried. Then there was the group of strolling players who had appeared from nowhere all of a sudden. Well, not all of a sudden. Exactly. They had arrived when the smell of roast fowl had begun to spread across the plain, and they had taken up position there, stoutly maintaining that one of the children in the House of Orphans was a distant relative, which meant that they too were part of the company. The strolling players were 2 good grandparents, 6 great-grandparents, 7 parents, both fathers and mothers, and 23 children, ranging once again from little more than toddlers to young adults, with all the possibilities in between, and practically none of them capable of walking more than a few leagues. Then there were the old people who had escaped from the northern farm, which was a place where they put old people, apparently the same way than put orphans in the House of Orphans. The people ate in proportion at the amount of work they were still able to do, and since the old people were pretty exhausted, given their old bones, they couldn't do enough work to eat more than a frog. One of the sentries from the House of Orphans had come back and asked if he could stay. He was a big fellow with pimples and red hair, who had been given the honor after being one of the inmates of the house of becoming one of its guards. Roasts, geese aside, he had come back because he couldn't think of anywhere he could go, anyone else he could be with. He had neither the capacity nor the courage to go wandering on his own, and he couldn't work out why he should have given the life he had always led. At, at least he was fit and healthy, and the same was true of the voluntary workers from the county of Delaga, two diggers armed with hoes and a carpenter woodcutter equipped with an axe and a saw, who had escaped from the iron mine beyond the hill to the north. Yes, the smell from the spit had reached as far as that. That was the direction the wind blew, and one becomes very sensitive to scents one hasn't smelled in years. The three of them were in the most precarious position to do so to speak, because they had brought their tools with them. They maintained that the tools had always belonged to them, and had been theirs long before the judge had assumed power, and asserted that everything under the sun between the dark mountains and the high valley of the Dogan belonged to Delaga, when in fact the woodcutter had inherited the axe directly from his father. But these objects had now been declared the property of the county of Delaga. So not only were they guilty of stealing geese, they were also responsible for the theft of tools, which meant they could be hanged twice rather than once. Finally, as though all of that were not enough, the hospital to the east, beyond the ditch which, with the brambles, had been cleared. No infections, diseases, fortunately just the halt, the lame, the scrofulous, and people so exhausted that they could barely stay upright, who had declared that they would rather die on the spot than go back where they had come from. And that was that. No, they were not all well enough to escape. If the whole group had been in a fit state to walk for a whole day, there would have been no need to resort to banditry to get hold of the horses. The oldest, the sickest, and the youngest children couldn't have walked all the way to the dark mountains, not in a single stretch. Perhaps with the whole of the county's army hot on their heels, and there would have been little chance of snacks on the grass or picnics among the flowers. No, the dragon couldn't flee, not before he'd drained the last of the beer and gotten over his hangover. In fact, had he been in a position to escape, he would already have gone back to the Black Mountains, because he was a dragon, the last of his tribe, the last of his species, and dragons had never mixed with anyone who wasn't a dragon, and he would soon have had enough of sniveling brats and moralistic, moralistic elves, not to mention that terrible hangover of his. It was as though someone were hammering away at the inside of his head, and each bang was a spasm of pain, faint but deadly, between the fourth and the fifth parietal bones. And while they were on the subject, the pain in his back feet hadn't passed either, not to mention the pain in his back. In his back. Josh seemed to remember that dragons had a total of three parietal bones, but after the years spent with her brooding Erbrow the Elder, he had developed a remarkable sensitivity that told him when to keep his mouth shut. The fog thinned out and showed the peaks of the hill, where half a dozen little scorched patches of earth interrupted the regular pattern of the vines. Josh stared at them in puzzlement. Foul Pest explained that beer gave the dragon hiccups. That was chapter 32 of The Last Elf. Next time I read to you chapter 33. But till then I say, see ya.